Once that we saw that our character is working correctly in Unreal and there were no issues importing it, we can work a little bit further within the aesthetics of it. In order to do that, I would like to use some vertex color and store the specific data into it. We're going to store ambient occlusion, the curvature and convexity of our model. And in this way, we are not going to need to use any UVs or import textures or any of that. It will keep it a bit more simple, and then you will find a new technique to style your characters as well. The first step, I'm going to clean up a bit the bottom of this export. I'm going to color maybe this orange because this is just for preview. And this is what we're going to do and use for exporting our character. What we need to do is to recreate the mesh. So here, now that I go, it's really tiny, it's right here. So you can press H in the viewport and you're gonna home the model. And with this, we're gonna create the vertex colors. We are gonna need to calculate the ambient occlusion. And for that, we can grab the ambient occlusion from labs. And here, if we check the ramp and I move it a little bit, you're going to see that it's really calculating the shadows within the model. And this is going to be quite useful for shading it later in Unreal. I also would like to measure the concavity and the convexity of our model. So we can drop this measure curvature by labs as well. And it's going to create the attributes of convexity and concavity. And here you can see that within the green and the red, those are stored. And what we can do is to take out the visualized output because we don't want to have it stored in the color. We're going to do it individually. What we're going to do is to store the ambient occlusion, the convexity, and the concavity within the red, blue, and green channels of our vertices colors. And in order to do that, we're going to use a point blob. And we're going to drop it here. I'm going to visualize it. And inside, we're going to check how that works. Right now, in our color, we have the ambient occlusion stored, but it's within all three channels. So we need to only select one. In order to do that, we're going to get the color, and I'm going to get the float from vector. Vector to float. And then here we can break the component of a vector to a float. And then if I visualize one, it's still the same color. What we want to get then is the convexity and the concavity. So I'm going to bind the parameter. And here I can type convexity. And here you can see that the attribute is present within our geometry. And then we would need to make a vector. So float vector from float to vector. That's the name of it. So here the ambient occlusion will be the float one. It's going to be the red channel. The green channel is going to be the convexity. And then I could visualize this as the output color. Now you can see that already I have the features of this weird color here, this greenish color, and it starts to get all these values that we stored. And I also want to get the concavity. And then this is this one. And that's going to be for the blue. And you can see that once I plugged it in, you see that it's present as a blue channel for our data. Now what this does is that we have stored these attributes within the vertex color of our model, and then we need to give it to our character mesh, right? So in this case here, if I go back to our capture weights, we see that this, if I get a null after it, obviously it's going to be gray because these values are not passed, but we would need to do some space here and then pass this back to here. Now our mesh is indeed storing the values of the color, and we will need to export it again to Unreal. We would need to maybe not change any of the naming, so it will just override the file, and then we can just save it again and re-import it. Back into Unreal, this is our mesh. I think we could try to maybe re-import it like this. We can try. We can re-import. And because we didn't change the path of the file, maybe it now got the vertex colors, but sometimes the vertex color option is set off, so this might not work. But I think we could try to visualize the vertex color here. And indeed, it's visualizing it, so it did work in this case. And this is the color that we are going to use in order to shade it. And different channels contain different aspects of the color. To do that, we could create a material, because in this case, our character here is quite gray still. So we need to create a material. And I'm going to name it as m underscore, let's say, character. And inside the material here, I'm going to basically get the vertex color that we just got. And I'm going to set it as the base color. I'm going to apply it. In this case, this pre-visualization, this sphere has no vertex color, just white. And if I drop it back to our character, now we see that it does get the vertex colors. In order to colorize this character, this is not the final color, this is just like the data of the color of the data, actually. What we're going to do is to use color curves, which turned out for me to be quite interesting to work with. And we're going to use this data in order to select when we want it. We go back to our material, we are going to create a few parameters. We are going to create a metallic value. We're also going to create a specular. And we're also going to create a roughness, material roughness. If you want to create this value, you can press S and click. You want to create a new parameter. You can also create a constant by just saying constant. And you can right click and convert to parameter. The shortcut in this case would be S and click, then it's a bit faster. In this case, I'm gonna plug the metallic here, the specular, and the roughness. I'm gonna put it a bit better. I'm gonna create a vector parameter for a color. I'm gonna create color. In this case, I pressed V and then I typed it. If you don't get that, you can also get a vector, constant. So a constant 3, or in this case a 4. And you can do the same, convert to parameter. And this will be a color. I'm just going to set it to white for now, alpha 1. Just leave it here for now. And that's what we're going to need to be able to lerp between the colors that we want and the values that we have. We can duplicate the vertex color and get the ambient occlusion directly plugged into ambient occlusion. The color, I'm going to take away the vertex. I'm just going to apply it. I'm going to save it, compile it. And you see that the ambient occlusion is a little bit already present. We could also create a material instance for this character. And then I can just name it mi character and apply this instance to the character. And this will allow us to change it a bit more throughout our workflow, so we can work with values without the need of having to compile every single time. In order to get these values, we're going to use a lerp. And a lerp is basically going to use the value that we stored as an alpha. And then we can create a secondary color for now and name it color 2. Maybe I'm going to just put it like blue for now. And the white's going to come to the A value and the color 2 is going to come to the B. I'm going to plug this into the base color. I'm going to apply it. I'm going to save it. And then let's see how it works. Here, it's very invisible actually, but at the tips of the fingers, it thinks the color that we just set. It's very invisible because the value of the mask probably is not really high, but you can see that the blue is now present throughout the model. Now we could try to visualize the other values. So in this case, the blue I think was concavity. This would be convexity, excuse me, and this we could try the concavity. So if I plug the blue channel, we can see that now the blue is indeed inside instead of the tips of the fingers. We could create a more exaggerated mask within Houdini, but we can do that a bit later. And we can create specific values for this so that we can change the roughness or the metallic. For example, we could make that the values that are like the tips of the fingers, we could make them really metallic and quite rough, and we can change these values depending on these masks that we created. Then let's plug the alpha and the metallic into, instead of a color tool, we can use this lerp to create different types of metallic values. So we could copy a new lerp and we could say that the metallic, this one can be passed as the first input and the other one can be just 0. So there will be no metallic, and we are going to use the green channel of our vertex color to drive the alpha. Then we can apply it. And here is a very personal preference within of what you think would work. So here, if I bring the metallic, actually did the opposite. It's metallic in the area of the body, but the tips of the mesh are not so metallic. So we could do, there's many ways that you can work within the shader graph of Unreal. We could basically invert this graph. So we can say here, we can do a 1 minus, and then it will become the opposite. So if I apply this, go back, now the metallic parts are here. I see that it's not super detailed where these parts are, so I'm going to jump back into Houdini and make these masks a little bit more prominent, because right now it's not such a well-distributed mask. Back in Houdini, now I'm going to create a bit better, more defined mask. Maybe here I'm going to change here the multiplier of a specific values. And remember to render this part, because otherwise the weights will be rendering constantly. And of course, there's better ways to do this, but eventually we will figure them out. This is just a bit first test, trial and error, see what works for you. Here we can multiply. We can also change like the intensity. Maybe it would be nicer that more parts are a bit more blue. And the same goes for this part. So now our mesh is maybe a bit intensely saturated. You will have to figure out, you see, you can use the blur to make the parts of the mesh less intense. The same would go for the other one. You can also blur it a little bit. This seems a little bit more defined, so there will be a bit more difference between the parts. And I'm just gonna re-export it again and see how it looks now in Unreal. You can see now that the parts are much more defined. So here I have more interesting shapes within the edges of this mesh. And as well for the blue, it's appearing a little bit more. You can also see that the resolution is not insanely amazing. And the reason for that is that our mesh is not extremely well rounded in that sense. We didn't remesh it. So we just put it out of the box. And I think for now will be fine enough, but it's just a way to show you different methods of styling this. Adding a little bit of roughness can create quite an interesting look already. So here with really simplistic colors and this use of masks using the ambient occlusion, the convexity, the concavity, you can create quite a lot of different variations. For example, we could use the concavity to make them luminescent. We could go back to the material editor. I'm going to minimize this, and the blue channel here, we could say that in this vertex color we would like to apply a lerp. So I press L to get that lerp again, so that would be this blue, and I would like to get the color as emissive. And again, this is really trial and error. See what works for you, what makes it look interesting. What I liked from this is that it becomes quite handy to think how you want to have certain things, and it's quite interesting. So in this case, you see that the blue, we added a tone of luminescence that will also work with Lumen in Unreal, which is quite interesting. Another tip that I have for this project is to have a color curve instead of a solid color as a secondary color. In this case, if I come here and I check the secondary color that we made the parameter of, you can see that you can now change quite a lot the different colors. But if we want to have what we have as the end result, to have a lot of different results and different colors, I figured out a way of using a color curve and drive that in a randomized way to get many different shapes and colors. So, excuse me. We can create a new color curve. To do that, we're going to go miscellaneous curve, and I'm going to choose the curve linear color, and we can just call it color character. Gonna close this, and here you can, just like in Houdini, any other software, you can create your own special gradient, and this is what can drive these extra types of color of our character. In this case, maybe this for me would be quite interesting, just quite soft, not too crazy. Now we have a gradient, maybe this color is a bit too strong. I'll leave it like that. This is up to taste. Everyone can choose whatever you want. And we need to get this color curve in an atlas. We need a curve atlas. And then will be this for color character. And this is basically storing curves within a texture. So here we're going to get the gradient curve. And we're going to get our new curve, so the color character that we just did. And this will allow us to access it within the material. So now if I go back to our material, I can type to the curve atlas parameter. And here this would be our curve. In this case, I'm going to select the atlas, which is this one we created, the color character. And this is the curve that we want. We're also going to create a parameter, and we're going to call it curve index. And this basically is going to drive at what point of the curve we are. In this case, the index goes from 0 to 1. So any random value we give it between 0 and 1 is going to give us a random color within this gradient. And it's a way that I found to create randomization of color in a controlled way without having to create a lot of code. You just use a gradient and you get a specific part of it depending on what value you give it. So now instead of this blue color, I'm gonna control click so I can grab these two colors, these two wires, and I'm gonna pass it through this curve, and I'm gonna save. Now we can jump back into our character, and if I open the material instance again, we can use the curve index from 0 to 1, and you will see that it goes throughout our character. Now, the main color, which is white, maybe it's not something that we really want. We could create two different gradients, depending on what we are looking for. So we could do that. So one for the convex light and one for the base color. What we could do maybe is to duplicate this color curve, and then I'm just going to name it inverted. And here I think we can adjust the hue. So it's another way that you are inheriting from a specific gradient, and it's going to keep a similar aspect of what the color that you choose. Let's say that we want this for our secondary. So you can see that even though they are quite different, they are still would be quite complementary in that sense. And remember to add it into the atlas. This would be our second color. And then we can do the same here. So I can copy it back. And this could be the curve index secondary. And then we need the curve index primary. And they both gonna drive different curves. In this case, I'm gonna get the inverted, and this could be our white color. Now these parameters we can delete because we are driving the color with these curves. Can apply this. And now if I open back our material instance, we have these two indexes. So one is for our inside and the other is for the outside. And you can always, now, if you want to change the color, you just use the curve to change it.